Hello and good evening. Welcome to the Archaeology Files. I'm Katie and I will be your tour guide through this guided tour of Noah's Ark. This is episode 3, and before we begin, we just want to have a word of prayer. So if you could bow your heads. Dear Lord, please be with us as we look at the story of Noah, as we see all of the wonderful things that you've been able to, preserve for us so that we can know that your word is true. Be with us as we look into this further and protect us throughout the week. In your name we pray, amen. So, if you joined us last week, this is the third presentation. I just want to give a little recap of what we've covered so far about Noah's Ark. And if any time you have a question during the program, please feel free to throw it in the comments section and we will answer those as we're going through. Always love the questions and the interaction. If you have a question afterwards, you can, comment on our Facebook page or on the YouTube, send us an email. We do have a form on our website that you can go to leave comments and feedback. So please, we want to hear from you. For last week and the week before that, we covered when Noah's Ark actually occurred. So we see this Bible timeline up here. This is information that we've, gotten from the Bible. We've aligned the information that the Bible has provided with the BC AD dating because that didn't exist back then. But we know that the flood occurred sometime around, 2300 BC. We know that it was after creation, but before the Exodus. So this gives you kind of an idea about where it is in relation to us today. We also covered where Ararat was. So Ararat is famous for being the location where Noah's Ark landed. We discovered that Ararat is the ancient region of Armenia. It is between a specific river and two lakes inside of this red shaded area on the screen right about there. We found out that, hey, there actually is something called Mount Ararat, but there's Mount Ararat Greater and Mount Ararat Lesser. So the lesser is here and the greater is all the way over here. But just south of that location is where we are looking at the Noah's Ark landing site. And this is at a place called Doomsday Mountain. There was a landslide that formed a bottleneck through the mountains, in which we can see highlighted in yellow. We can see how this landslide affected the region. The area in question is inside of this red circle. This was picked up on a 1956 satellite imagery or aerial imagery that was taken. And a captain in the Turkish army was looking over this footage and said, hey, I think we should send somebody out here to investigate. So that is really what started the investigation of this particular location. From there, we've gone further to actually go to this site and look at it closer and measure it out according to, ancient cubits, and the object in question perfectly matched the 300 cubits of the Royal Egyptian cubit. That was different from all of the other cubits. All of the ancient cubits that were the long cubits are approximately the same length. Royal Egyptian is 20.6 inches. The Hebrew was 20.4. So it doesn't seem like that much of a difference, but once you're, talking hundreds of cubits, those little point of an inch add up really fast. So this is exactly 300 Royal Egyptian cubits, or 515 feet in length. When they were doing scans on this location, you were able to do the radiography and see that, hey, guess what? This site actually has uniform rooms and right angles and rooms that seem to be specified for, certain animals. We know, an elephant doesn't need the same size cage as a rabbit does. So we see these variations in room size. What we also see is we see an opening, a square shaped opening on the middle deck. And yes, I said middle because the scans also revealed that there are 3 decks to this location. Furthermore, they did metal detecting scans, picked up metal, picked up and were able to actually test what appears to be rivets. When these rivets are gone and placed under analysis, we find that they contain high quantities of iron, aluminum, and titanium, which the aluminum and titanium are of the forms that do not occur naturally. These have to be processed, which means that these are not just natural geologic formations. This is definitely something that is man made, just to verify that, hey, they did these tests back in the 70s with the metal detectors. Let's make sure that their readings are accurate. Turkish government sent individuals in and a team of scientists in 2021 and 2022. They redid the scans, and guess what? They came up with the same data. We also covered, the identity of what pitch is. Pitch is not the byproduct of the flood, because it couldn't be, because if the pitch and the tar that we've always assumed was used on Noah's Ark wasn't made until after the flood because of all of the decaying debris, then it had to be something else. So what exactly was that pitch? We have determined that this was a tree-based resin that we still use today to prevent rust and for bulletproof vests, for using to cover actual boats that are ocean bound. So this is something that we're still familiar with. Just another idea on how skewed our views can be when it comes to historic events, that we've been told something and we've never even questioned it. But when we actually start looking at it further, it's not always what we've been told or what the tradition says it is. Another thing that we went over was the fact that Noah's Ark was actually a giant desiccator. They were sealed in there by God. We can find the silica remnants in the bottom of the boat. What these things would have done is worked for temperature control, reducing humidity, absorbing any excess moisture, preventing mold and algae growth. Could have definitely helped with the smells in the area, and would have worked for any chemical transporting that Noah's Ark was doing, because they were not technologically dumb. They were actually rather smart, and anything that they would have needed to make tools, once they got off the ship, they would have had to bring some of this stuff with them. So that is just a very quick overview of the things that we've discussed on our past programs. So now what we are going to do is we are going to get into the new material, starting with some anthropologically significant things that are found in the nearby region. And then we'll also be talking about the contents of the Ark, not the Ark necessarily itself. So starting out with some of the significant things nearby, we're actually going to have to go all the way over to the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, it's a lot of shipping that is going on and sailing. And so along the Mediterranean, whether it be in Egypt or Israel or Greece or Italy, we can find these anchor stones. Now, anchor stones, typically you're having to lift them, so you don't want them to be something that is too heavy for you to lift or that is just way too tall. You've got to put that on your ship. If you were with us when we were talking about the Sea of Galilee boat, that is a ship that, you're not going to want too heavy of an anchor on, because it would go straight through the bottom. So the anchors, typically the absolute largest ones, are going to be the ones that you're going to see on your screen over here. And let me get my face out of the way so you can actually see it. This is actually one of the largest stones, anchor stones, that they have pulled from the Mediterranean area. It only goes up about waist high. Typically, you're seeing them under 1 meter, so think, 36 to 40 inches. Those are some of the larger ones. Some of the smaller ones, we're talking down to, centimeters, less than 100 centimeters. So these are examples of anchor stones. And so you want to note how these stones are drilled. These stones appear, particularly here, you can see where it's kind of smaller in the middle and wider on the outside. That is going to come into play when we change slides. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to a map now of the Noah's Ark area, the Noah's Ark region. So we have here Mount Ararat Greater, Mount Ararat Lesser, the landing site right here. But we're going to travel this direction, so northwest-ish, and we're going to go up to this ancient structure site that I've got marked right here in the upper left of your screen. Now, this area is a very beautiful area. I mean, can you imagine waking up to this view every day? It's a very beautiful, beautiful area in there. But there's something in particular about this area that is very fascinating for any ARK researcher. The locals call it the place of the eight. Now, why would that have any significance? If you can think of why that might have some significance to the story of Noah, go ahead and throw that in the comments section. This is a picture of some of the stones that are found in this area. And notice the size of these stones. These stones are huge. And actually, when you were looking at these stones in this village, the place of the eight, if you look in the background here on this image on your left-hand side where my cursor is pointing, that is Mount Ararat Greater. So you can actually see Mount Ararat from this location. These are anchor stones. Some of them have been broken, as you can see on this picture on the right, the upper right. Some of them are on their sides and also broken. They are significant because they have crosses. This one in particular is one of the more famous ones, and we're going to change slides here so that you can get a better view of this one. So this one right here, about 7.5 to 8 feet of it is above ground. There's approximately 4 feet underground. So in total, this is a 12-foot tall anchor stone. It is designed practically identically to the ones that we're finding on the Mediterranean, from being smaller carved and then the larger carving. There's a place on the inside where the knots for the ropes would have, you'd tie it and then the knots would slip in and then it would tighten so that the knots would not slide back and forth. You can see that these are not thick stones. And some people thought, well, you know what, because there are crosses carved all over these are things that have been left by these are Crusader style crosses. So think, between the 800s AD to the 1300s AD. These crosses have been carved into practically every stone that was visible. And they said, well, simply because these crosses are here, this is Crusader markings. The Crusaders are the ones who did this. This is not associated with Noah's Ark at all. The Crusaders, if you know anything about them, they would go through and they would mark religious sites. And by marking the religious sites and by putting these crosses on them, they were signaling that, hey, this is of some religious significance. And when they went to go dig in the area, they actually found more of these anchor stones that had no crosses on them whatsoever. And when they are looking at when these, stones are dug up and, is it possible that they were still buried at the time of the Crusaders? And yes, these stones were still buried underground when the Crusaders were going through, and they didn't see them, so they couldn't put the crosses on them, which means that the stones predate the Crusaders and that the Crusaders were not the ones to make these stones. And as you can see in this upper left-hand picture, there's dozens of them. And the more that you look for them, the more that you actually find, and they are covering the entire area. Now, what's interesting about this, did I mention any large bodies of water nearby, or did I mention mountain ranges? I haven't talked about any large bodies of water nearby because the closest large body of water is Lake Van, which is 75 miles away. So why would these absolutely ginormous anchor stones be scattered all over the area where Mount Ararat is, where the city of the Place of the Eight is, where the place that's called Doomsday Mountain is, that's high, high, high up in the mountains at a very high elevation with no large bodies of water nearby? It doesn't make any sense unless at some point this entire area was covered with water and there was a very large ship nearby, because it would have taken a very large ship to be able to use these stones without being drug under. Now, I want to show you something. It's been reported that National Geographic actually did a study on, hey, can Noah's Ark actually exist? And so they took some of the designs from various accounts of the Ark. Like we learned the first week, there was ones that were round, ones that were cubes, ones that are, long canoes. And they tried various Ark designs, and they put them in a big pool that they designed, a wave pool. And this wave pool, every single time, it flipped and it flipped and it flipped. And they're like, no, these arcs, there's none of them that could withstand something as violent as how the flood is described. So I'm going to show you a clip that has reportedly been left out of that documentary. I have tried to find the documentary myself. I cannot find it. You can actually look on YouTube. It is currently live from the point at which this video is being made. It may be removed at some point, but let's go ahead and watch this clip and see what was left out of this video.
To find out whether Noah's supposed technology works, Day has added weights beneath the model Ark. This time he's programmed in even bigger waves.
Now that, without the deck, would definitely have been over.
Amazingly, the Ark survives the giant wave impact. The stabilizing anchors have worked. Without them, the Ark would have turned over.
Okay, so what this clip is showing us is that Noah's Ark, if it didn't have these anchor stones on it, would have actually flipped. So these anchor stones worked as a ballast almost, and it kept the anchors to stabilize the Ark. And we don't know how many of them would have been on the ship. We know that they were attached by some sort of rope or a chain. We don't have those available to us now to see. But we do know from the remnants that we are finding is that there must have been a lot of them. We don't know how they came disconnected. It could have been a system that Noah and his family had rigged so that they could simply, pull a rope and, anchor 562 would fall. Or it could be that as it got caught up in the debris or started hitting bottom, that the tension would become too great and it would simply break away. But we do know that if it hadn't had these anchors, there's no way that the ship itself would have stayed afloat. So then we're going to look in that same area, the Place of the Eight, and we're going to look at some different types of stones. These are not anchor stones. These are gravestones. Now, gravestones are always very important. Gravestones can tell us, modern days. It tells us, when somebody lived, their name. Sometimes it tells how they died or why they died. In the case of Noah and Noah's family, it does give us a lot of information. Now, these stones are no longer available to view because after the initial discovery of them in the 70s, the people in the area either broke the stones up and destroyed them or carried the stones away because they thought it matched treasure and they didn't want people to find buried treasure. We do see similar events occurring in the 1930s in the U.S. in places like Oklahoma and Texas, where ancient stones from, the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s that had been marking specific locations. During the Great Depression, people thought that they marked buried treasure, so they didn't want somebody else to find the treasure before they had a chance to dig, so they would carry away some of the stones. So we don't know if that's the type of situation here, but for this particular area, these stones do tell us a lot of information. The pictures are kind of blurry because the footage that it was taken from was not the best of quality. You got to think this is 1970s, so we don't have, high definition photos, but we do have two stones that are marking some type of event. There are Crusader crosses carved into them. So the Crusaders saw these and realized that they were significant. It's hard to see in this particular image, but you can see where there is an arch here that resembles the shape of a wave. And on top of that is carved the shape of an ark or a ship. And walking away from that, there is a series of 8 individuals. And this sketch here is a very rough draft of what this carving showed. Now, do we know what Noah and his family looked like? We do not have a description in the Bible. In the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q 534, it tells us that they would know who Noah was because he was going to have red hair and a lentil-shaped birthmark on his face. But is that accurate? It's the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's historic tradition. We really don't know for certain. But this gives us an idea of the style of drawings that's in this particular region in a time that is much more ancient than the Crusaders. So when we look at this area, we're looking, do we even know Noah's wife's name? We do not. There are many different traditions of what her name may have been. Most people go with either Noah, Emzara, or Naamah. One of the traditions is that the Naamah that is listed in Genesis is one of the descendants of Cain, is actually Noah's wife. There is no biblical proof of that. Emzara is another one that is very, very common. So Naamah or Emzara are the two that you're most likely to see. But near this location where these tombstones were, later on, they actually went back there and somebody had dug up one of the areas in front of where this tombstone would have been, and there was a pit. Now, this pit was very long. It's thought to have contained a sarcophagus that was somewhere between 18 and 19 feet long. There was about $100 million worth of jewelry that showed up on the black market shortly thereafter that they believe may have come from this location. There was also some very large human remains, some very large bones that were on display in local shops in the area shortly after this event occurred. Those have been lost over time mostly, but there is one thing that is very interesting. So the individuals that dug up this location were in a great rush to dig it up. And so when they were digging it up, it's believed that they were trying to get the jewelry, and so they started either shaking the body or just were very quickly putting things into either crates or cartons, and some piece of the hand actually fell into the dirt surrounding this area. And those bones were collected and examined by physicians and anthropologists. These bones are the bones of a left pinky finger. So if you want to hold up your left hand as a left pinky finger, here they are, that right here in order. Over here on this side of the screen, you have them just kind of sitting in a box together. When we're looking at these bones, we can actually get an estimate on the size of the individual that these bones would have come from. And one of the interesting points is that this bone right here, this bottom bone on the left here, does show some signs of arthritis. This would have been the left hand, like I said. The average male, so there's a picture of two individuals that are showing just how large these bones are. So this is the pinky finger of a male who is looking at these bones and examining them. This is the index finger of a woman who is showing just which bones comes from. And when we are looking at this, the average male pinky from where it connects to the main part of your hand to the tip is about 5.97 centimeters. Now, this can vary, but approximately it's not 5.97 centimeters on average. This line is exactly 2 inches long. So we can do a guesstimate, and I'm going to highlight that this is a guesstimate, but we can take this 2-inch long line and we can line it up to this finger, and it comes to 6.25 inches approximately. Now, I went and I did some research, and I found in the Indian Journal of Clinical Anatomy and Physiology a study that was done estimating stature size on little finger length so that they can identify individuals whom may have be deceased, and they're trying to find information about, how tall were these individuals? Is there anything that we can do to find them? So they did this study on the relation between the little finger and the height. And what they found in this study is that on average, females are approximately 160.21 centimeters in height. Males, on average, are 176.66. So these are averages. This is not everybody individually. These numbers are going to vary based on, who is the person that is doing the study. But the little finger length on males pretty much is consistent between their right hand and their left hand. But on females, the pinky finger of the left hand is typically, on average, 5.42 centimeters. So if we are looking back at our finger bone, we can estimate that, on average, females are 160.21 centimeters. We're going to divide that by 5.42 centimeters to figure out the average height per centimeter of a pinky finger. And this is actually pretty accurate because I went through and I tested it using my pinky finger. My pinky finger is approximately, X amount of centimeters, and within an inch, it was accurate for my height. So I just wanted to double test and make sure that, I'm double checking the study here. So when you do all the calculations, you figure out, hey, this pinky finger is 17.91 centimeters. We're going to multiply that by the 29.559 centimeters, and we are going to get 529.4 centimeters for the height of the individual. If we turn that into inches, that is going to be 208.42 inches. So anybody want to take a guess on the height? How tall is 208.42 inches. Go ahead and take a guess. I'll give you a minute to get your guesses in there, think about it, and then I'll reveal how tall. All right, put the calculators down. Here we go. It is 17 feet 4 inches tall. This person is at least, 17 feet tall, which kind of matches some of the information that we've been finding. You'd have to actually physically measure the bones to get, an exact height. But just averaging it out, looking at, the information that we have, this could vary, but 17 feet is nothing to wink at. That is quite the height. I personally would not want to meet somebody who is 17 feet tall. But when you're looking at the tombstone, what I did want to mention is that the one tombstone has the second person in line, who is a female, with her head turned away and facing down. The other tombstone have both the first and the second individuals with their heads facing down and turned away. So it is thought that based on this, the individuals that are associated with a boat on a wave walking away from this location with 8 individuals, the female would have died first, and then the lead male would have died, which if this is Noah and his wife, Noah's wife would have died first, followed by Noah. When you are looking at the National Museum, the National History Museum of Armenia, they have some lockets in the area in their collection that they have collected, where there are some very familiar looking carvings. In it, we see an ark-shaped object with flowers and people around it. And then we also have an individual who resembles some of the individuals from the carvings in the rocks, or tombstones, making not making the altar, he's making a sacrifice on an altar. So we have these carvings in the area that were on these lockets of people that are making sacrifices and what appears to be the actual Noah's Ark site. And we do have stories from Josephus, who says that you could actually still go and see Noah's Ark in his day. We have, a list of other individuals that are from before Josephus and after Josephus that are saying, hey, we can actually go see Noah's Ark and do a tour guide here. There are stories from the area that say people would come to Noah's Ark and they would, want to go get a piece of Noah's Ark, or potentially buy a locket. This was the equivalent of the I went to Noah's Ark and all I brought you back was this locket sort of thing. Talismans, lockets, all of these different things. If people can make a buck, people have not changed that much. If they could make money on it, they would try to make money on it. So this is potentially things that are referencing Noah's Ark and the story. We do know that we have cylinder seals of the story of Noah's Ark that come from the general vicinity. This is a reference back to the story that's from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is not in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a cylinder seal that is telling the story where Gilgamesh is learning about the individual who was in a flood. You see the water that is surrounding this individual who is in this box shape, who according to the mythology, built this boat and survived a great flood that destroyed the world. So we see all sorts of anthropological evidences in the general vicinity that go back to the story of Noah. Other things that we find in the area are ancient structures. This one is interesting because it is in a valley. And if you stand up in the valley right here, and in this diagram, it shows you, picture A, there's an altar up there. And when you're standing up there, your voice actually echoes down. These are photos from when they were originally doing the research in the 70s and 80s. I believe these ones were from the 70s. This is the house. Now, notice the house is got about 4-ish feet of height to it. Some places don't quite have that much, but you can still see that there was obviously some type of dwelling or structure, and the stones are still standing. But when researchers went back to the area, just like with the tombstones, the structure had been knocked down. So this is what the structure looked like in the mid 2000s, 2010, 2012 range. This is all of the walls, anything that had been remaining was knocked down to the ground level. And up here you can actually see the remnants of the altar, which we will look at closer in just a bit. Then the 2020s hit, and there was finally permission to actually excavate the area. So a team from a Turkish university went in and they started excavating at ground level. And this is what it looked like when they were taking a break from their excavations. So they started at ground level, and they have, dug down quite a lot over a large area. Here is another aerial view of the location where they have been digging. Now, these are what is called test pits. So that's not, multiple houses here and here and here and here. These are test pits. And a test pit in archaeology is something where you can go through and you can choose to have an open pit, or you can choose to have a closed pit. A closed pit gives you a buffer between one section and the next. Pits vary from site to site. Sometimes they can be 5 feet by 5 feet. Sometimes they can be much larger. It's kind of up to the anthropologist who is doing the research. But one of the benefits is that when you're digging in these pits, you can leave sections of the dirt. So if you go back and you're like, oh, well, I noticed this deformity in level X, you actually have a reference point where you can go back and you can look at that wall that you have left and see if there's maybe something in there that you might have missed. But this is one view. Here is another view from a different angle. You can see how thick the walls are on this portion of the structure right here. It does go down, and we can see the top of the wall right across here if you're looking at the upper left of your screen. They've also done some larger test pits over here, and there's a portion of a wall that they've uncovered right here in the middle of this large open test area. Now, one of the interesting things about this large open area is that they did discover something there, and they've left it in place for the photos. So this is your close eyes warning if you do not want to see human remains in an archaeological site. I would suggest closing your eyes now, because we are going to be revealing what the picture shows without the blurred image. So I'm going to go ahead and do a 5 countdown, and then I'll show you what they discovered in this location. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So in this location, they discovered right here in the center of your screen, this is a burial location, and I'm going to zoom in because there's actually 2 burials here. There is a burial of an individual, and then there's an adult individual, and then to that individual's left, which would be on the right side of your screen, there was a child or an infant burial. What is interesting about this, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen so that, anybody who wants to open their eyes now can go ahead and open those. They have not dug to the bottom of this site yet. So when this burial occurred, do you typically see burials at ground level? I'm going to let you think about that for a minute. Would you see a burial at ground level? When we're talking burials, we're talking typically of digging down or digging something over top of. So, say, some of the tombs from the time of Jesus, that's ground level and then tombs built over them. The Egyptians were talking tombs built over them, body as at ground level. But when we're actually burying somebody, we're talking let's dig down into the ground and place dirt over them. From this archaeological site, we can see that there's no building that's actually built over top of that we can identify yet over top of this burial location. So that would indicate that this was actually open ground, which means that when this individual was buried, what they were buried, and they should actually say two individuals, these individuals were buried at ground level, which ground level for this structure here is much lower. So the burial is a newer burial compared to the structure that we have examined over here that is coming down. So they were buried in the ruins of this area. What significance is that? That means that either this building was associated with somebody of importance, it could have been a burial of convenience, but it did occur after this main area had been in use and probably abandoned at some point. This large area, I'm going to move the slides over a little bit more. See, we have this large area here and then a semicircle. It is thought that this area is either a kitchen type area or it would have been some type of niche for maybe idols or display. But we're not quite certain yet. The consensus seems to be leaning more towards ovens, but until the official archaeological reports come out, we won't know for certain. And don't hold your breath on those, because sometimes you can see an archaeological report right away. They'll do a yearly update. But full in-depth archaeological reports oftentimes aren't released for years afterwards. There's some that could be 10 years later before you actually see an official report. But just to show you how large these walls are, these are wheelbarrows. And the wheelbarrows, if you measured the wheelbarrows and then you measured the length of the wall, these walls are somewhere between 6 to 7 feet in width, just right here. And they have not dug and done any excavations out this direction from this wall. So who knows what, might exist under the soil over in this area. Just gonna flip through these quick. This is another example of the site after, they were working on finishing up their excavations. So in the earlier pictures, we're not seeing these rocks here and these large rocks that they left, as they found them, which sometimes it's very important to do so. So they even dug further down than when those pictures that I was originally showing you, and we can see this is what remained. Now, do they leave this site open year round? That is, again, up to the discretion of the individual that is digging. Some sites, what they will do is they'll actually put a tarp down and they will put the soil on top of the tarp. And that way it protects the site from, all of the weather elements during the off season. Sometimes they will simply just fill it back in with the dirt that's in use. It will have to be redug the next season, so it does take additional time, but it works to preserve the site because that is of the utmost importance, is preservation of the site. And in an open location like this, we certainly would want to do that. Places that have enclosures, like some of the stuff that we see in Israel, they've actually built facilities over top of the excavation site to protect it. If you walk up the mountain, this is a possible altar. You can see when you're up close where there's indentations from where they would have led sacrifices up to this location. And you can, when you're standing at this location, you can hear out. This rock is thought to be about 12 feet in height. And in this location over here, there's actually, you can see where there's little carve outs so that they could loop rope through to tie up their sacrifices prior to, let the sacrifice sit there and graze while they're over here performing their duties, and then they can go back over and get the other sacrifices, or they could leave their, donkeys, mules, whatever their form of transportation was, and they had a place where they could safely leave them while they're working and performing their duties over here. There is a location, if we go back over towards Doomsday Mountain. Some people, have issue with David Deal. Some people do not. I am showing you all of the potential evidence. It is up to you to make an informed decision, but I would be remiss if I didn't show you some of his work. He was examining LIDAR, and based on his findings with the LIDAR over by the Noah's Ark site, he has identified potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient structures that dot the hills of the area. And I'm going to show you on a map what this actually would look like. So this is the Noah's Ark site. This is one of the potential regions where the Ark originally would have resided before the landslide. Up here in this region is where Mr. David has performed some of his work and has found evidence of structures there. Other individuals have found and been able to verify that, yes, there are ancient houses there. When those ancient houses were built, that is left to be determined. But there is evidence of large city that was up at this location at one point, which would make sense if this was a tourist location, or, if this is one of the areas that would have originally been settled when they came out of the Ark. And so if we're looking up in this region, this would have been the area where we believe that Noah's family would have settled. They left this little valley and just followed this main big fertile valley up into this region more, where we're finding those anchor stones. On the border of Turkey and Armenia and Iran, there is a monument that was formed from ancient stones that had fallen around the area. And when you go back and you look at the footage of the stones as they're being placed to make this new monument, this discovery, you can actually see that the stones have markings on them. If you take those markings and you place them out onto a drawing, it is believed that this would have been what was originally portrayed on the monument that resided in this area, that has since been demolished and then reassembled to form a new monument. But it shows the U-shaped mountain, the mountain that would have crumbled in a landslide, that we see all of that dirt debris that was down through the bottleneck. And then we see a boat object with 8 individuals and 2 birds associated with it, which matches some of the story that we're reading about Noah's Ark in the Bible. A family affair. So, input time, get ready to type or think. we're going to talk about what was on the boat itself. Passenger manifest. So, if you think that there was a great number of people on the boat, because how could the world repopulate so quickly and have all these people unless there was, a lot of people in the boat? Think or type in A into the comments box. If you think that, hey, you know what? There was only 8, Noah and his 3 sons and Noah's wife and the 3 sons' wives, type in B. Give you a second to think about that, and then we'll reveal the answer. Okay, if you said B, you are correct. We can read about how many people were on the ark all through the Bible. We see it all through Genesis. We see it in 1 Peter and 2 Peter and Hebrews. Genesis 7:7 says it best when it says, "And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark." So how did we get repopulation? When we are looking at population patterns and population growth rates, we can easily come up with a very, very large number. If you wanted to look up more information about population growth rates, I highly suggest there is a series that doctors Robert Carter and C. Hardy did that really explain it great. But if we're talking about, population after the flood and population before the flood, we can determine exactly, how many people will have been dealing with as far as, pre-flood, and how many people may have been around at the time of, say, Tower of Babel or Abraham. So we are going to start out with 4 couples. If we start out with 4 couples, and each one of those couples has sons and daughters, at the end of 1,650 years, we are going to have a population that is well into the billions. Now, don't think that that is an impossibility. Let's look at Genesis 5 and 11. It says that all of these individuals had sons and daughters. This is plural, so they're having more than 2 kids each. If we look at today's population, from 1800, there was about 1 billion people. To now, it's estimated that we are now at the 8 billion mark, possibly more. I think back in 2020, there were 7.8 billion that they were estimating. In just 220 years, we've jumped from 1 billion to 7.8 billion. That is a lot. We've been through civil wars and world wars and flus and pandemics, and we still are growing population leaps and bounds. If we take the growth rate that is mimicking the current growth rate, if we start out with just Adam and Eve and we go over 1,650 years, because we know that the flood occurred 1,656 years after the flood, or after creation, we are at a population growth rate of almost 9 billion. And that is a very low growth rate. If we go through and we lower that to basically no growth rate at all, we just drop that growth rate down as far as we can possibly go and still be maintaining life, we're looking at a population of 45 million at the time of the flood. This is a tremendous amount of people. 45 million to 9+ billion. That is just stunning numbers. And to think that only 8 people got on the boat, and we're told that at the time of the end, it's going to be like in the days of Noah. That is a scary thought. If we go back through, we know that the world was repopulated by Noah, and we have Noah's 3 sons. And through Noah's 3 sons, we have all of the nations of the planet. One of the things that people say is, oh, hey, we can't do that. We can't account for all of the variations, or that's just not enough people. There had to be more. But we're actually looking at what is called genetic bottlenecking. Genetic bottlenecking is when we start out with a large portion of genetic material, And then over the course of time, that genetic material gets divvied out in various ways. And so certain traits go certain ways. And that is where we can actually see all of the variations that humans have today. And we can also see this in the variations of animals that we have. So, for example, let's look at some Punnett squares. We start out with pink flowers. Now, pink flowers have the possibility of, reproducing red flowers, reproducing white flowers, or reproducing pink flowers. So for the first generation, we have every genetic possibility known to man. But when we start getting into the second generation and we take this generation here and we have them start reproducing, all of a sudden what we see is some divergence here. So we see possibility with no white flowers, we see a possibility with no red flowers, and we see a possibility that brings us right back to our original genetics. We've got all of the possibilities. When we get into the third generation, this is where it really starts getting narrowed down, and we see this verse in Exodus 25 actually starts to take effect. So by the third generation, we could end up with absolutely no genetic diversity at all, partial no genetic diversity and partial genetic diversity, or total and complete genetic diversity. Same thing with this generation, no genetic diversity, partial or total incomplete. And then by the time that we get to the fourth generation, you could be totally and completely excluding 75% of the world's genetics if you're at a specific area. And where can we see this? Well, it's very obvious when we look at elephants. When we're looking at elephants, there's a variety of elephants, but we're going to look at African and Asian just for example. African elephants, what are some of the differences that you can see between them and the Asian ones? I'll give you a minute to go through and think about it, and then we'll look at this further, and I'll highlight some of the differences that are examples of genetic bottlenecking. All right, if you've had a chance to think about that, first of all, the ears. The ears, the shape of the head, the fact that the trunk has multiple, we have 2 fingers here. This one only has 1 finger. The lack of tusks on certain Asian elephants versus African elephants. So we have a wide variety of genetic diversity, but they're still elephants. When we're looking at human genomes, this is a human genome from a lot of different humans. We can see this is another one of the charts that Dr. Carter's and Dr. Hardy examine. So I do recommend going to look at theirs. But each line would represent an individual, whereas each column represents a specific trait. This is what you should see in a healthy, genetic, diverse population, because if there is a mutated gene, chances are that it's not going to be passed on to a majority of the population. However, when we're looking at a bottleneck event, this is where you've got a population that say they go there, they stay there, and they do not introduce any new genes for several generations. You're going to end up where, like with this particular gene, there is no diversity whatsoever. So if this is defective, you're going to see that come through in every person within the population. Same thing with this one. You're going to see some potentially negative traits within your populations. So bottlenecking is not necessarily the best, but it does explain why we have different features today, such as, attached earlobes, detached earlobes, different hair colors, different skin tones, different skeletal features, variations in animal breeds. And while we're still on that topic, I want to quickly go over how our genetics actually prove creation and the flood by looking at Y chromosomes and mtDNA. So Y chromosomes, when I'm talking about DNA, Y chromosomes, that is in your nuclear DNA. That's going to be in the nucleus of the cell. This is also where your individual unique DNA is, as long as you don't have an identical twin. If you do have an identical twin, it's still where it's going to be, but you and your twin will just have that same DNA structure. But your Y chromosomes and your nuclear DNA is going to be found in the nucleus. When we're talking mtDNA, we're going to be looking at the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. That's this green little kidney bean looking like thing right here. This is what gives your cells energy. This is passed from mother to her children, but it can only be passed down through a female line. So while a male will carry his mother's mitochondrial DNA, he cannot pass that on to his children. So this can be tracked through straight female lines, whereas Y chromosome data, that can only be traced through the male line. So how does this help us prove the flood and creation? There's this thing called mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. When we are looking at this, we know that all men on the planet descended from either Shem, Ham, or Japheth, and they came from Noah. Noah would therefore be our Y chromosome Adam. This is explained because the Y chromosome, we can trace that down through all of the variations in the genetic bottlenecking, and we can trace that. There is a tradition that the females, the girls that the boys married, were all sisters. But the problem is that the mitochondrial DNA line is actually older. We can trace it back further than we can trace Y chromosomes. If it's passed from female to female to female to female, and the other is passed male to male to male to male, what we are looking at is a female line that is older than a male line. How can this be explained? Well, this can be explained by the fact that the girls were not sisters. While the men were all brothers and they all descended from Noah, the girls could not have been sisters, and therefore they had variations of the mitochondrial DNA. So their DNA may have looked something like this, where yes, it does go back to Eve, but it's back through various branches. So here is a more simplified version. All of the males descended through Noah, therefore Noah is our Y chromosome Adam, but all of the girls that were on the boat, we have to go back further to get to a common female ancestor, which would have been Eve or potentially one of her daughters. But Eve is most likely mitochondrial Eve, and Noah is Y chromosome Adam. And I know we are over our 1 hour timetable. So I'm going to give you a second and let you vote on whether or not you think that we should continue on, what was living on the ark, or if we should call it a day and pick up next week where we left off with living cargo on the vessel. So I'll give you a minute to get your feedback, and then we will make a decision on if we should stop. I'm thinking that unless somebody wants us to keep going, I think that an hour is probably long enough. It's a lot to digest all at once. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and pause here. This gives you something to think about for the next week, is a sneak peek. Do a little digging and see if you can come up with evidence from the Bible of other living cargo that would have been aboard the ark. And that is where we will pick up next week. We'll discuss that. We'll discuss some of the environmental impacts of the flood, and maybe even get into fossils. So thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure studying God's Word with you and sharing all of this information. Like I said, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments box or, Facebook or email us. And that way we can go through and find the answer to your questions. And be sure to join us next week, 6 o'clock, where we will be picking up our discussion on Noah's Ark. If you want to join us for our Q&A session on Friday nights, that is at 8 p.m. So we would be glad to have you join us for that as well. Let's go ahead, bow our heads. We will close with prayer. Lord, thank you for being with us this evening. Please just protect everybody, as I know the East Coast is expecting some potentially not so friendly weather. So just be with everybody. Help us to continue to do your will. Be with us as we study and open our hearts and minds to what you want us to do. In your name we pray, amen. Thank you for joining. Have a great one.